Hi, my name is Phillipa Vincent-Connolly, and I am a historian. I've studied with the Open University, I've done a history degree with them and teacher training, and I'm halfway through an MA with them, and I'm looking to do a PhD on disability history next year. I'm in the middle of writing a book at the moment called Disability in the Tudors or the King's Falls, looking at how the Tudors treated people with disability in the 16th century. And I think it's a really important subject to cover, because a lot of historians look at it and think it's quite taboo. It's something they don't really want to sort of discuss at length as a social history, because obviously it brings up a lot of issues. It's a bit like the way the BLM movement has now come to the fore, and lots of people are talking about black history and how that matters. Well, disability history matters just as much, because disabled people are a minority, and the way we treat disabled people and more vulnerable people in society tells us a lot about our society as a whole. And this is one of the reasons why I started to look at disability history, and particularly with the Tudors. As you can see from my bookcase behind me, I've got a plethora of books. It's one of my favourite periods in history, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to study this particular topic. And also, I was born with a disability myself. Back in 1970, I was £2 2 ounces, and I was born at 26 weeks, which meant that I ended up having a diagnosis of cerebral palsy. And just curiosity, as I've got older, I've wanted to understand how disabled people were treated in the past. And so naturally, to put those two subjects together, to me, seemed like a common sense. So I began looking at this topic, and if any of you have ever visited Hampton Court Palace, if you go up to where the Chapel Royal is in Hampton Court, just adjacent to the entrance to the Chapel Royal, upstairs along the Haunted Gallery, there is a portrait of Henry VIII and his family, which is circa 1545, painted in the style of Holbein. It shows distinctly two people on either side of the painting. Underneath some archways, there is a lady called Jane on the left hand side of the painting as you're facing it, and on the right hand side there is a gentleman in a red velvet gown and red hose. He is stood with a monkey on his shoulder, and he is on the right hand side of the painting. Now, these two people were so important to be included in this family portrait of Henry VIII. But the surprising thing about these two particular characters is that we think that they had some sort of disability, possibly something like Down syndrome or a learning disability. And so therefore, why were these characters so important to be depicted with Henry VIII, with Jane Seymour and his 3 children? They must have been quite significant. He must have had very important relationships with these two particular characters, and that's what started me off looking at it. And also, we know at the time that the Tudors enjoyed a lot of entertainment at court, and they would sometimes have people to come and entertain them, like jesters. But these two characters were not jesters. They were what we would call natural fools. So they had a learning disability or disorder, perhaps Down syndrome like I've said, or some sort of distinct issue that they couldn't necessarily function in society as an able-bodied person would, and they needed people around them to look after them. Will and Jane were two such people. Will Summers actually had keepers to look after him, to order his clothing, to make sure he ate proper meals. Henry VIII would fund all this. He would fund horses for Will, saddlery, leatherwork for his horses, stirrups, clothing, distinct clothing for him, and he came into Henry VIII's life just towards the end of Anne Boleyn's reign. So we're thinking the end of 1535. Will was in Anne's household and Henry VIII's household, and they were looked after as if they were members of the family. So, and Henry had a very close relationship with Will Summer, because we can see that in different portraits that have been made of Henry and Will together. There's one at the British Library in Henry's Psalter, which has got Will Summers distinctly stood there in front of the painting, leaning into the viewer, and Henry VIII is sat behind him with a harp, looking like King David. And Will Summer was a companion to Henry, and the Tudors believed that disabled people were closer to God because they had a distinct disability, and therefore life was harder for them. But they thought that God spoke through these natural fools and spoke the truth and were very honest. So these disabled people were not put on a pedestal as such, but they were honoured, cared for, looked after. They were listened to. They weren't just there to make fun of people, to joke, to jest. They had a function. They were there to lift people's spirits, to make Henry happy, because we all know that as his reign progressed, his health got worse, his physicality got worse, and therefore he needed people to cheer him up. And this is where Will Summer and Jane came into their own. Jane was initially looked after by Anne Boleyn and ordered clothing and caps for Jane Fall, and then obviously after Anne Boleyn's execution, Jane then went into the household of Princess Mary and was looked after by her, and she was much loved. And then when King Henry VIII married Catherine Parr, Jane actually went into the household of Catherine Parr, and Catherine Parr actually ordered some geese for Jane to actually look after and herd around Whitehall Palace Gardens and Hampton Court Palace Gardens as a hobby, and apparently she really enjoyed that. And there are records of all the clothing that were bought for these two people, so we understand how important they were. They weren't dressed up as servants, but they weren't dressed up as nobility. They had their own distinct style that Henry agreed to for these two people. And so this was where to start with it, really. And then I began to look at poor laws. I began to look at almshouses and hospitals and how the disabled were treated within the community, how families looked after the disabled, how Thomas More, for example, was a bit of a philanthropist, and he had a young gentleman called Henry Pattinson live with him, who was also a bit like Will, had a distinct disability, but he too was honoured and included in the family, and sat down at the dinner table with them and discussed politics of the day. Henry Patterson also discussed with Thomas More about his views on the Catholic faith, and signing all the paperwork that Henry wanted Thomas to agree to, so that he didn't have to go through his trial and execution. But of course Thomas More didn't listen to anybody but himself and God. But so there were people like that looked after disabled people. They're not as well documented like obviously nobility and kings and queens are of the period, but they're there, and they weren't seen as different in terms of a stark difference like we might see disabled people today. They were included in society, looked after, loved, cherished, and that was what astounded me so much about the Tudors. And then you look at Henry VIII himself. He owned at least 2, if not 3 wheelchairs himself as he grew older, and the ulcers on his legs got so bad that he couldn't put any weight on his feet. And he also owned a stair lift. He had a Stunner stair lift installed in Whitehall Palace to get him up and down 26 steps in the palace. It was like a wheel and pulley system. I talked to David Starkey about this at length once, and he was saying it was a bit like a wheel and pulley system that might have put cargo onto the Mary Rose. So it was a way of being able to lift Henry's bulky weight without the courtiers doing their backs in, for example. And there were reports of ambassadors seeing Henry in a wheelchair, although he tried to not sort of let too many people see him in the wheelchair. There were reports of him being seen in a wheelchair. He also had a cane with a whistle on it, so that if he ever fell over, he could blow the whistle and alert his Privy Chamber staff that he'd fallen over and needed help getting up. He also had a megaphone that he could actually shout into for people to come and help him if he needed it. Can you imagine Henry VIII's bulky weight falling on the floor? They'd probably need about 4 courtiers to actually come and pick him up. And he was probably really embarrassed by this. But the reason why we know this about Henry is that these are all in his inventory of the items that he owned upon his death. And it's well documented by historians like Maria Hayward, for example. And these are the sorts of things that I was looking at and thinking about when writing my book. And this is what I want to continue to study when I'm doing my PhD. So how were people in London with disabilities treated by the court, and what laws were put in place? How did society view them? Because obviously there were the beggars who pretended to be disabled, and they would be flogged or arrested, or all sorts of things might happen to them if they pretended to be disabled. So there's all sorts of issues around it. And then the almshouses and the monasteries, when the monasteries closed because of the Reformation, what happened to ill people then? And then you had places like Bedlam that would look after disabled people, and disabled people would be on view as if they were exhibits in a circus, and people would go and view them at Bedlam on a day out. So you have 2 very different positions of how disabled people were perceived in the Tudor period. You also had the fact that if a baby was born with a disability or severe deformities, then they were considered maybe the spawn of Satan, or that their mother had been in league with the devil, or something horrendous like that, or it was to do with witchcraft. And so you had these 2 very, very different attitudes towards disability in the Tudor period. And I think it's very fascinating to discuss it and look at it and raise awareness about it, and to talk about it and compare to what we actually do today for disabled people. Have our attitudes changed that much? Have we put in as much support as we could do for disabled people today? And have attitudes changed that discrimination is less, that disabled people can live really fulfilling lives and contribute to society and really make a difference? And this is why history is such an important thing to look at and to research, because it informs us and gives us a better way of living today, and makes us think about how we can improve things for the future. And that's really why I decided to go down this route of looking at disability history. So it's a conversation that can continue to grow and develop as we study more and we find out more. So I hope that's really been informative for you. Thank you very much.